Hello, everybody. I am Jackie Zhao with CasePrepMaster.com. Most recently, I have been getting a lot of requests from my subscribers on the subject of what do consultants really do. Therefore, I have made this video that really answers this question and gives you a perspective on the job of a management consultant. Throughout this video, you will hear me explain on a broader basis what consultants typically do across different types of industries and different types of projects. But just to add more meat to the bone, I've also included a very specific example of an actual project that I worked on when I was an intern at the Deloitte Strategy Consulting Department. So, what do consultants really do? In order to answer this big question, I would like to break it down and answer the two smaller questions that together will fully explain what consultants really do. And by the end of answering these smaller questions, you will definitely get a better grip of the bigger question. Overall, the two smaller questions I would like to answer today is, one, what types of problems do consultants solve? And two, to solve a problem, what do consultants specifically do on a day-to-day basis? Hopefully, by the end of answering these two smaller questions, you will have a better understanding of the bigger question, which is, what do consultants really do? Great. Let's start by answering the first question. What types of problems do consultants solve? And to provide a case in point, I would like to talk about the actual project that I worked on as an intern in the Deloitte Strategy Consulting Group. So for my particular project, our client was a very large clothing retailer based in China that focuses mainly on sportswear retailing. And what a clothing retailer means is that our client handles the retailing portion of a lot of major clothing brands, especially sportswear. You can think of an example with Nike. Say if Nike wants to sell its shoes and apparel in China, our client would open stores for them and basically help them sell. So with this client, the particular problem that we were helping the client with was revenue growth, or how to help this clothing retailer client grow its revenue. So how do you grow revenue for a large clothing retailer? To answer that question, our team's approach to this problem was to bucket revenue growth into two major categories. One, how to grow revenues for the client's core existing business, which is retailing for clothing and more specifically sportswear brands. And two, how to grow revenue by letting the client explore new capabilities that are not yet the client's core business. Perhaps how to grow revenues by retailing for non-clothing brands, or better yet, perhaps adding a non-retailing portion to the business altogether. So as you can see already, as a consultant, our team approached this problem in a very MECE way, or mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive way. Because to grow revenue, there can really be two ways: to grow the existing revenue and to grow revenue by adding new capabilities. So let's dig a little bit deeper on each of these branches. So how do you grow revenue by growing the client's existing business as a clothing retailer? Well, it's pretty obvious. What you do is you add more brands to partner with and retail for. If you open a lot more stores for a lot more different brands in different clothing categories, then obviously revenue will increase. So as a consulting group, what our team had to do was to find the most attractive and lucrative clothing categories for our client to retail for. But there are so many different clothing categories out there. Just to name a few: outdoors, sports fashion, men's and women's shoes, jeans, etc. How do you know what is the most attractive clothing category for our client to partner with? So what we ended up creating was a chart like this. which shows quantitative data on the different clothing categories in China. Take a look. As you can see, on the horizontal axis, it shows the market size in billions of RMB, which is the Chinese currency, of the different major clothing categories. And on the vertical axis, it shows the growth rates, or compounded annual growth rate, of all major clothing categories in China. In other words, we were trying to find the clothing categories that had the biggest size and grew the fastest, or in the top right corner of the graph, shaded in green. You can think about it this way. If a particular clothing category, for example, kids apparel or kidswear, has a huge market size in China, meaning that a lot of people in China would want to buy in this clothing category, but also has a very high growth rate, then that particular clothing category and brands within that category have a pretty good chance of making money if our client were to retail for them. So this is actually what we ended up doing as a consulting team. So as a consultant, we created a graph like this and tried to find what clothing categories or what brands were on the top right corner of this graph, so as to recommend them to our clients. Remember that to help our client solve the problem of growing revenues, as a team, we decided to help the client grow revenue in its existing business, as well as by adding new capabilities. In the end, in the existing business portion, we wrapped our recommendation around this graph and suggested to our client that in order to grow revenue on its existing business of clothing retailing, it should partner with selected brands within the clothing categories in the top right corner of the graph, namely sports and sports fashion and kidswear. After our team wrapped up revenue growth in the client's existing business, we then focused on how to grow revenues for our client by adding new revenue through new capabilities for the client. And as a consulting team, how we tried to solve this problem was to look at the client's business expertise right now and see how we can expand the client's business based on its current expertise. So right now, the client is a clothing retailer, meaning that the client is really in the clothing or sportswear industry with the business function of a retailer. That is, the client helps other brands sell stuff for them at the storefront. So if we want to expand the revenue by adding new capabilities to our clients, what our team suggested was to try to expand these new capabilities into two major directions. One direction on expanding the client's industries outside of clothing or sportswear, and the other on expanding the client's business functions outside of being just a retailer. And we aim to grow the client's revenue by letting the client add these new capabilities. On the new industries direction, the client can transition from retailing for only clothing and sportswear brands to other non-clothing brands such as furniture and others. On the new business function direction, the client can explore the possibilities of transitioning from a retailer to performing other business functions as well, such as being a clothing manufacturer. As a consulting team, we help the client explore in these two directions so as to give the client ideas on what it can do to grow revenue by adding new capabilities to the company. I will not go into details on what we did specifically towards this end, but the two directions represent our team's main focus. So to summarize, what I've illustrated in the past 6 to 7 minutes is a pretty good indication of what types of problems consultants solve. And as you can see that as a consultant, not only do you have to solve the client's toughest challenge, but also you have to solve it in a very comprehensive and MICE manner, which is mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive manner. That is easy for the client to understand and accept. Had we as a consulting team only focused on one part of the client's problem, say on just expanding its core existing business by partnering with more clothing categories and more brands, then we would not have conveyed a very convincing proposition to our client. So this just gives you a glimpse of what types of problems consultants solve in the real world. In reality, revenue growth problems are only a very small fraction of the types of problems that you may be solving for your client. In addition to helping the client grow revenue, you might be helping the client reduce a very large portion of its fixed costs, for example, or you may be helping the client evaluate 10 potential acquisition targets to find the best company to acquire, and many other problems. Also, you will work with clients that are not only in the clothing retailing industry, but instead in hundreds of different possible industries that there are out there. So this sums up the topic of what types of problems do consultants solve. Now let's jump down to the second small question, which is to solve a problem like the revenue growth problem I just described, what do consultants specifically do on a day-to-day basis? Many subscribers of mine have said consulting is basically punching numbers in Excel and making PowerPoint slides. That is actually completely not true. Excel and PowerPoint are very essential tools to have in a role of a consultant, but it does not explain what consultants specifically do. On the contrary, what consultants specifically do on a day-to-day basis is really two things. One, consultants come up with hypotheses on how to solve the problem. And two, consultants try to collect data to validate or reject those hypotheses so that the final solution is correct and factually sound. For a typical project, the consultants would take around 10% of his time to come up with hypotheses and take the vast majority or 90% of his time on the validation part. What do I mean by coming up with hypotheses? Let's just take the project that I did for the clothing retailer as an example. When our project team tried to help our clients find a very attractive clothing category to retail for, we came in as a team, sat down, and spent the morning, drew a lot on the whiteboard, and brainstormed on a hypothesis. And one of the hypotheses was that our client should start retailing for kidswear. And at that point, it was really just a hypothesis, a hunch or intuition that some members of the team had that kidswear will be big in the future. After coming up with that hypothesis, what we had to do was then to validate or reject that hypothesis by finding very robust and reliable data to prove whether what we assumed was true or not. And that data is a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. Just to give an example, to gather qualitative data to validate our hypothesis on kidswear, our team conducted dozens of interviews with experts in the Chinese retailing business to get their perspective on what are clothing categories that will be avenues of growth in the retailing industry. In addition, we also had to find quantitative data. Remember this graph? This graph on the growth rate and the market size of major categories is what I mean by quantitative data. In order to prove that the kidswear will be an attractive clothing category for our client in the future, we had to prove that kidswear had a huge market that was also growing significantly. As a consulting team, we did exactly that. We went online and went to a lot of expert websites that provide this type of quantitative data. and compiled them to make this graph. As a matter of fact, the data on kidswear proved our point and had a big market size and growth rate compared to other clothing categories. This would eventually lead us to present kidswear as a good partnership opportunity for our client. Had we found that kidswear didn't exhibit strong market size and growth rate, we would have presented a different, better clothing category to our client. To summarize, coming up with hypotheses and collecting data to test those hypotheses are what every consultant does on a day-to-day basis. The more detailed things, such as cold calls, expert interviews, or using PowerPoint and Excel to drive a solution, are really just tools that help consultants do the two things that are most important: coming up with hypotheses and collecting data to validate or reject hypotheses. So this is what consultants do specifically on a day-to-day basis. So here we have answered the two smaller questions. Now you know what types of problems consultants solve and what do consultants specifically do day to day to solve that problem. The combination of these two topics answers the overarching question of what do consultants really do? So how does this help you pass the case interview? By understanding what consultants do and how consultants approach a problem, by coming up with and validating hypotheses, you now understand what interviewers are looking for in candidates. They're looking for exactly that type of behavior. The behavior of trying to come up with a hypothesis for a problem and asking for and analyzing data to validate that hypothesis. And the interviewer really wants to see if you have the capability of doing those two things, and to see if you will be a good fit as a management consultant. So to successfully pass case interviews, you have to really mimic the behavior of a very good management consultant. And you have to be very good at coming up with hypotheses, and you have to be very good at asking for quantitative and qualitative data to validate the hypothesis. So how do you do that? How do you phrase a hypothesis in the right way? How do you ask for a key piece of data to try to validate a hypothesis? Do subscribe to our free resources that explain these topics, as well as provide exclusive articles on consulting and case interviews. This is where you can also refer to our Ace the Case program, where we teach you exactly how to bring a hypothesis-driven approach that interviewers are looking for, and where we will help you pass the case interview. All of these resources are available at www.caseprepmaster.com. So, what do consultants really do? Now, you tell me.